When my mom and stepdad went on their honeymoon, I wasn't exactly trusted to watch the house. So instead of being left on my own for the week, they sent me to my Uncle Mike's farm. He lived with my Aunt Lisa and my cousin Luke. Their place was a big, old-fashioned farmhouse with wooden beams, the kind that creaks when you walk upstairs. They had this spare bedroom overlooking the fields, and that's where I stayed. The house felt comfortable during the day, but at night, there was something different about being out there, surrounded by nothing but miles of crops and a handful of scarecrows. This was mid-October, so my uncle was right in the middle of harvesting corn. The first morning, he asked if Luke and I could give him a hand. It wasn't the most thrilling thing to do, but surprisingly, I didn't mind. It was kind of peaceful, actually, just hand-picking corn and throwing it into these little baskets while looking out over the fields. No fancy equipment, no combine, just the three of us under a cloudy sky, walking through rows and rows of corn. What really caught my eye, though, were the scarecrows. My uncle had 3 of them scattered across the field. Each one was different, dressed in old, tattered clothes, a mix of flannel shirts and sweatpants, with these big straw hats covering their heads. I remember asking Uncle Mike how long it took him to make them. He just chuckled and said, "Not too long, but they get the job done. Crows stay away most of the time." That night, after we wrapped up the day's work, I hung out with Luke in the living room. We played some video games for a while. Then, once he went to bed, I retreated to the guest room with my laptop. It must have been past midnight when I heard a soft thud against the window. At first, I thought it might just be a tree branch or something blowing in the wind, but there were no trees near the window. So I sat there for a moment, letting the silence sink back in until a second rock hit the glass. This time, I froze. It wasn't a coincidence. I turned off my laptop and stared at the window, wondering if I should look outside or just pretend like I didn't hear anything. My heart was racing, and I had this weird creeping feeling that someone was watching me. After a minute or two, I mustered up the courage to lift the blinds just a little. The moon was bright enough to light up part of the field, and I could see one of the scarecrows standing out there, still as ever. But then, just as I was about to lower the blinds again, something caught my eye. I blinked, unsure if I was seeing things, but I swear, one of the scarecrow's arms was moving. It waved. I slammed the blinds shut and stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. Was I imagining things? I had to be. There was no way a scarecrow could move, right? I ran down the hall to Luke's room, but he was already asleep. The house was eerily quiet, everyone else dead to the world. I thought about waking up my aunt and uncle, but what would I even tell them? That their scarecrow waved at me? Eventually, I made my way back to the guest room and peeked out again. The light outside was off now, but the moonlight still cast an eerie glow over the fields. The scarecrow hadn't moved. It was standing in the same spot, slumped over like always. I stared for what felt like forever, but nothing happened. I let out a shaky breath, thinking maybe I was just tired or paranoid, and crawled back into bed. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Aunt Lisa made pancakes, and Uncle Mike was already outside working. Luke and I sat at the table, eating quietly until Uncle Mike stormed into the house, looking more furious than I'd ever seen him. "Where the hell did the scarecrows go?" he barked. We all went outside, following him out to the field, and sure enough, all 3 scarecrows were gone. Just gone. My stomach dropped. I told them what I had seen the night before, the movement, the rocks hitting the window, but I could tell by the look on their faces that they didn't quite believe me. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those scarecrows, about what had really happened. I tried to push the thoughts away, convincing myself it was just a prank, or maybe I'd just imagined it. But around 2 a.m., the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite ring. It was frantic, continuous. I shot out of bed, and by the time I got to the hallway, I could hear Uncle Mike and Luke rushing downstairs. I followed close behind them as Uncle Mike flung open the front door. There, standing on the porch, were the scarecrows. All three of them. But this time, they weren't dressed in the same old clothes. No, they were covered in something dark, streaks of red paint dripping down their bodies like blood. I felt my blood run cold as my uncle called the police. They came out, took a look, and said it was probably just some teenagers messing around with an early Halloween prank. But something about it didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a prank. Whoever, or whatever, had done this, they were sending a message, and I wasn't about to stick around long enough to find out what it meant. It was fall 2019 and I was 20 years old, living temporarily on the East Coast just outside the Appalachian mountain range. My name is Ethan, and I'll admit it up front, I've never been the outdoorsy type. Camping and hiking weren't exactly activities I sought out, but with it being my last year in one of the best places for outdoor adventures, I thought I might as well give it a shot. Plus, it was mid-fall, and the leaves were putting on their annual show of gold and red. I decided to start small, a simple hiking trail that promised some great mountain views. Nothing too intense. I packed light, just a small backpack with water, snacks, and a first aid kit, and I made my way to the trailhead. When I pulled into the small dirt parking area, I noticed something. There were no other cars. No one else was around. I shrugged it off, figuring the trail just wasn't that popular. The hike started off peaceful. The trail was narrow with trees lining both sides. There were no fresh footprints in the dirt, no signs of anyone having passed through recently. As I walked, the sun dipped behind the dense canopy of trees, shading the trail and creating a cool, almost serene atmosphere. It was nice, quiet, calming even, but the further I went, the more unsettling the solitude became. Not in a paranoid way, just in the sense that I realized how alone I really was. An hour, maybe two, passed before something unusual happened. Up ahead, sitting under a tree on the side of the trail, I saw a man. He looked like he was just taking a break, but something about him made me uneasy. As I passed, I nodded and said, "Hey." He didn't respond. No nod, no smile, just a blank stare that lingered for a few uncomfortable seconds before I turned away. That interaction left me feeling on edge, so I picked up the pace, trying to put some distance between us. After a while, I reached the end of the trail, which opened up to a stunning overlook of the mountains. The fall colors spread out before me, a view that almost made the entire hike worth it. I stood there for a few minutes, taking in the scenery, letting my nerves settle. But when I turned around to head back, my heart nearly stopped. Standing at the entrance to the trail, not more than 10 feet away, was the same man. I hadn't heard him approach, and the way he just stood there staring at me sent a shiver down my spine. He didn't move closer, just smiled, a strange, unsettling smile, and finally said, "How's the view?" "It's beautiful," I replied, trying to sound casual even though my chest felt tight. "You should check it out." He didn't. Instead, he pointed off to the side. "There's an even better view down that path," he said. I turned to look where he was pointing, a barely visible trail cutting through the thick trees. It was rugged, overgrown, and clearly not used often. Everything in me screamed to leave, but I felt frozen in place. Thanks, but I think I'm good," I said, starting to edge toward the main trail. But he didn't let it go. "It's just a minute down that way," he insisted, stepping closer. His tone was too persistent, and the way he positioned himself between me and the exit only increased my fear. I stammered something about needing to head home, but as I tried to walk past him, he moved to block my way. My heart raced, my mind running through all the worst possibilities. We were alone in the middle of the woods. No one was around to hear me, no one to help. For a few agonizing moments, he just stared at me, as if weighing his options. Summoning all my courage, I took a step to the side, trying to act calm and confident. I walked around him, keeping my pace steady, praying he wouldn't follow. He didn't say anything, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time, every hair on my neck standing on end. I glanced back a few times, and each time he was still watching me, standing in the same spot. He didn't follow, but I wasn't about to slow down and find out if that would change. I practically jogged the rest of the trail, and when I finally reached my car, I slammed the door shut, my heart still racing. I don't know what that man's intentions were, but they couldn't have been good. I've thought about that day more times than I can count, and I still can't shake the feeling that if I had followed him down that path, I might not have made it out of those woods. It was early October, about 2 years ago, when I decided to take a break from work and get some fresh air. My name is Eric, and after months of city life, I felt like I needed a bit of solitude. I booked an Airbnb cabin out in the hills, about a 2-hour drive from my town. It was remote, far from any other homes or buildings, exactly what I was looking for. I planned to spend a few days there, maybe do some camping, just to disconnect. The cabin was cozy but old-fashioned, not my usual style, but it had a charm to it that grew on me. Surrounded by woods, there wasn't a sound of civilization around, just the rustling of leaves in the crisp fall air. The first few days passed peacefully. I spent my mornings sitting outside, wrapped up against the cold, listening to the distant calls of birds, and my evenings by the fireplace, letting the warmth seep in as the sun dipped below the horizon. On the 5th day, I decided it was time to camp out in the woods. I wasn't sure how many nights I'd stay out, maybe 2 or 3. There was a hiking trail that led straight from the cabin, so I packed up my gear and set off without needing to drive anywhere. After about 3 or 4 hours of walking through the dense trees, I came across a small clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was the only open space I'd seen all day, and it felt better than camping right on the trail itself. As night fell, I settled in by my fire, the warmth cutting through the chill of the evening air. I had my sweater and jacket on, trying to enjoy the quiet, but then something caught my eye. A shadow, a figure moving through the woods far from the trail without a flashlight. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Whoever they weren't using any light, just walking through the trees like they knew the place by heart. It sent a shiver down my spine. Why would someone be out here, in the middle of nowhere, in the dark? I told myself it was just a coincidence, but it was unsettling enough that I considered heading back to the cabin. The problem was, it was already late, and hiking back in the dark wasn't safe. So I stayed on edge, watching the woods until I was sure they were gone. After a while, I flattened my fire, letting it die out, hoping I could get some rest. Just as the last embers faded, I heard it. Footsteps coming from my left, crunching on fallen leaves. I froze, my eyes straining to see beyond the edges of my camp, but the darkness was too thick. The steps came closer, then paused just outside the range of my vision, lingering there like whoever it was knew exactly where they wouldn't be seen. Then just as suddenly, the footsteps started up again, moving away, vanishing into the night. I sat in the dark, heart pounding, trying to figure out what to do. I knew staying out there any longer wasn't an option, so I quickly packed up my gear and started the long walk back to the cabin. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow path as I tried to keep my mind from wandering to the stranger I'd seen. The woods felt oppressively quiet, each step echoing through the trees. I finally reached the cabin, exhausted and running on nerves. It was well past midnight by then, and I collapsed onto the couch, not thinking much beyond the need for sleep. After all, whoever that person was, they were hours away now, deeper into the forest. But sleep didn't last long. I woke up groggy, disoriented by a noise outside the cabin, a scraping sound like something dragging against the wooden walls. My heart started to race as I looked toward the back of the room, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. That's when I saw it, the window slowly creaking open, and a man's face peering in. His eyes locked onto mine as he realized I was awake. He froze for a second, then let go of the window and bolted back into the woods. I ran to the window, my mind reeling, but he was already gone, swallowed up by the shadows between the trees. Panic surged through me as I grabbed my things, threw them into the car, and sped away from the cabin. I didn't stop until I reached a hotel in the nearest town, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he intended to do. But I can't shake the feeling that he'd been watching me for longer than I realized, waiting for the right moment. If I hadn't woken up when I did, I'm not sure what might have happened that night. And I'm not sure I want to know.